3. 42 U.S.C. Section 1988 Attorney's Fees and Costs, 19. F. Statute of Limitations does not bar this action, 20. 1. Fraudulent concealment tolls limitations period, 20. 2. Discovery rule applies to inherently undiscoverable misconduct, 20. 3. Processing delays demonstrate continuing violation. 21. G. Judge Bruce Bain's improper recusal compounds constitutional violations, 22. 1. Failure to report known fraud violates judicial duties, 22. 2. Recusal without investigation perpetuates injustice, 22. 3. D. Relief requested, 23. 6. Conclusion, 26. Table of authorities. Cases. Caldwell v. Barnes, 154S.W.3D93, Texas 2004, 13. Prazel v. Johnson, 967S.W.2D391, Texas 1998, 12. Mullane v. Central Hanover Bank and Trust Company, 339 U.S. 306, 1950, 15. Matthews v. Eldridge, 424 U.S. 319, 1976, 17. Monroe v. Pape, 365 U.S. 167, 1961, 18. Statutes. 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, 17, 18. 42 U.S.C. Section 1986, 19. 42 U.S.C. Section 1988, 19. 5 U.S.C. Section 552A, Privacy Act, 14. 4. Texas Government Code Section 51.205, B, 13. Constitutional Provisions. Texas Constant Art. I, Section 19, 9, 16. Rules. Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 21C, 4, 14. Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 215, 9. Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 239, 10. Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 329B, F, 910. Appendix A, attached. I. Introduction and Nature of Proceedings. This Bill of Review presents one of the most egregious cases of systematic court clerk misconduct and constitutional violations ever to come before this court. Petitioner Spencer Farwell, acting pro se, seeks extraordinary relief to set aside the July 8, 2021, final summary judgment in case number 2017-35361, which was procured through a coordinated scheme of fraud, record tempering, and due process violations orchestrated by Harris County Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels. 5. The underlying case involved a legitimate mold exposure claim that was systematically sabotaged through extrinsic fraud upon the court. Court Clerk Daniels engaged in a pattern of misconduct including 1. Unlawfully removing critical exhibits from the court record, 2. Negligently exposing plaintiff's Social Security number on the public docket in violation of Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 21C and federal privacy laws, 3. Deliberately changing plaintiff's address of record to defendant's law firm address to prevent notice of proceedings, and 4. Coordinating with defense counsel to ensure plaintiff remained unaware of critical hearings and deadlines. This misconduct denied plaintiff 8 years of due process, prevented presentation of a meritorious defense, and resulted in a fundamentally unfair judgment that must be set aside. The evidence reveals not merely procedural irregularities, but a systematic corruption of the judicial process that strikes at the very heart of constitutional due process and the integrity of this court. Petitioner seeks relief under multiple legal theories. 1. Bill of Review based on extrinsic fraud and due process violations. 2. Federal civil rights claims under 42 U.S.C. Sections 1983, 1986, and 1988. 3. Violations of Texas Rules of Civil Procedure. And 4. Systematic denial of constitutional due process. The evidence compels the conclusion that extraordinary relief is not only warranted but constitutionally required. 2. Statement of facts. A. Background and original proceedings. On May 25, 2017, Selena McDade filed a legitimate personal injury lawsuit against Fountains at Tidwell, Limited, and related defendants in case number 2017 to 35,361, alleging mold exposure and resulting health damages. The case was assigned to the 6. 165th Judicial District Court under Judge Ursula A. Hall. Defendants filed answers through attorney Joshua R. Flores on June 26, 2017. The case proceeded through normal litigation phases until a pattern of systematic misconduct began to emerge. On June 7, 2018, an order of non-suit was signed, dismissing the case without prejudice. However, on July 12, 2018, the case was mysteriously reinstated per court order, suggesting manipulation of the court record from the outset. B. The scheme of fraud and misconduct begins. The coordinated scheme of fraud began in earnest in 2020 when Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels initiated a series of actions designed to prevent plaintiff from participating in her own case. 1. SSN privacy breach. March 2020, Court Clerk Daniels negligently exposed plaintiff Falwell's social security number on the public court docket, in direct violation of Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 21C and federal privacy laws including 5 U.S.C. Section 552A. This breach was not accidental but part of a pattern of misconduct designed to compromise plaintiff's privacy and security. 2. Address manipulation. In a particularly egregious act, Clerk Daniels changed Plaintiff McDade's address of record in former case number 2017353361 from her actual residence to defendant's law firm address at 1401 McKinney, Houston, Texas, 77010. This ensured that all court correspondence, including critical hearing notices, would be sent directly to opposing counsel rather than to plaintiff, effectively guaranteeing she would receive no notice of proceedings in her own case. 3. Attorney withdrawal and abandonment. On February 21, 2020, plaintiff's attorney Craig L. Rushing, State Bar number 240715554, surreptitiously withdrew from representation without proper notice to his client. Rushing had failed to present critical medical evidence while plaintiff was still living in the mold-contaminated 7. Apartment, demonstrating either gross negligence or complicity in the scheme to deny plaintiff a fair hearing. See record tampering and document manipulation. The most serious aspect of the fraud involved systematic tampering with the court record itself. 1. Exhibit removal. Court Clerk Daniels unlawfully removed critical exhibits from case number 2017 to 35,361, including medical records, expert reports, and other evidence essential to plaintiff's case. Document control records demonstrate that exhibits that were properly filed subsequently disappeared from the court record. 2. Coordination with defense counsel. Email communications reveal that Clerk Daniels coordinated directly with defense attorney Joshua R. Flores regarding hearing notifications and case management, creating an improper ex parte relationship that violated fundamental principles of judicial neutrality. 3. Processing manipulation. The clerk's office engaged in deliberate processing delays and manipulations designed to prevent plaintiff from receiving timely notice of critical proceedings, and the record will show. D. The fraudulent summary judgment proceeding. On February 1, 2021, a summary judgment hearing was conducted via Zoom. Due to the address manipulation and lack of proper notice, exhibits missing from the record, plaintiff was discombobulated during this critical hearing. The proceeding was fundamentally flawed, and at this time the Honorable Judge Isla Hall of the 165th Court of Law stated that she would not make a ruling on such case number 2017353361 until all exhibits were located, but instead such judge did not do the same. 8. 1. Lack of notice. Because her address had been changed to defendant's law firm, plaintiff received no notice of the hearing and could not participate in or defend against the summary judgment motion adequately. 2. Fraudulent evidence. Defense counsel presented evidence and expert testimony that contradicted their own prior submissions, including a denial letter from expert Patrick McIntyre that directly contradicted earlier joint submissions of pretrial documents filed in or around February 12, 2020. This fraudulent document that was filed into the Harris County District Court warrants an investigation. 3. Absence of critical evidence. The exhibits that had been removed from the court record by Clerk Daniels were not available for the court's consideration, fundamentally skewing the evidentiary record. On July 8, 2021, final summary judgment was granted in favor of defendants. Plaintiff, still unaware of the proceedings due to the address manipulation, and after about a week plaintiff received a postcard that the case was over, so I immediately filed a notice of appeal on July 15, 2021, but the appeal was ultimately unsuccessful due to the corrupted record. Discovery of the fraud and current proceedings. The full scope of the fraud was not discovered until 2024, when Spencer Farwell, acting pro se because no law firm that plaintiff reached out to that held a Texas state bar license would not assist with this case, so I began investigating the case. On August 9, 2024, Farwell filed the current bill of review in case number 2024 to 51,449. Significantly, even the processing of the bill of review was subject to misconduct. Despite being filed on August 9, 2024, the case was not processed until November 9. 2024, a delay of nearly 3 months that appears designed to push the case closer to the 4-year statute of limitations deadline of July 8, 2025, and to take this miscarriage of justice a little further, on such said 9th day of August, 2024 plaintiff Farwell filed his bill of review in which exhibits were attached labeled Exhibits A through N that was once a part of the docket control order manifest, now missing today. This case was docketed in the 165th under Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels' care until Judge Bruce Bain recused himself, and looking at the record today, it only reveals plaintiff
He recused himself. He recused himself. Come on, Will.
Plaintiff's table of content for such exhibits that has vanished from to record today. F. Judge Bruce Bain's improper recusal. When the bill of review came before Judge Bruce Bain, he improperly recused himself without conducting any investigation into the serious allegations of fraud and misconduct. This recusal violated his judicial duty to report known fraud and perpetuated the denial of justice that has characterized this case for 8 years. Continuing harm and urgency. The statute of limitations deadline of July 8, 2025, for years from the final summary judgment, creates extreme urgency in this matter. The processing delays orchestrated by the clerk's office appear designed to run out the clock on plaintiff's ability to seek relief, representing a continuing violation of due process that demands immediate intervention by this court. 3. Issues presented. 1. Whether Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels' systematic record tampering, SSN privacy breaches, address manipulation, and processing delays constitute extrinsic. 10. Fraud upon the court sufficient to warrant setting aside the July 8, 2021 final summary judgment under Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 329B, F. 2. Whether the systematic denial of notice and opportunity to be heard for over 8 years constitutes a fundamental violation of procedural due process under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution and Article 1, Section 19 of the Texas Constitution. 3. Whether the constitutional due process exception to the traditional bill of review standard applies when a court clerk's misconduct prevents proper service and notice, thereby relieving petitioner of the burden to prove a meritorious defense and prevention by fraud. 4. Whether Court Clerk Daniels' actions, performed under color of state law, give rise to federal civil rights claims under 42 U.S.C. Sections 1983, 1986, and 1988 for deprivation of constitutional rights. 5. Whether the statute of limitations is told by fraudulent concealment and the discovery rule when court clerk misconduct is inherently undiscoverable and actively concealed from the affected litigant. 6. Whether Judge Bruce Bain's improper recusal without investigating or reporting known fraud compounds the constitutional violations and requires reassignment to ensure impartial proceedings. 7. Whether this court should impose sanctions under Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 215 and other applicable authorities against all parties who participated in or benefited from the systematic fraud and misconduct. 11. Page 10 of 33. 7,405 words. English, U.S. 1. Whether Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels systematic 1. Whether Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels systematic record tampering fraud upon the court sufficient to warrant setting aside the July 8, 2021 final summary judgment under Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 329B, F. 4. 2024, a delay of nearly 3 months that appears designed to push the case closer to the 4-year statute of limitations deadline of July 8, 2025, and to take this miscarriage of justice a little further. On such said 9th day of August, 2024, Plaintiff Farwell filed his bill of review in which exhibits were attached labeled Exhibits A, F. Judge Bruce Bain's improper recusal. When the bill of review came, G. Continuing harm and urgency. The statute of limitations deadline of July 8, 2025, 4 years from the final summary judgment. 3. Issues presented. 1. Whether Court 10. 2. Whether the systematic denial of notice and opportunity to be heard for over 8 years constitutes a fundamental violation of procedural due process under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution and Article 1, Section 19 of the Texas Constitution. 3. Whether the constitutional due process exception to the traditional bill of review standard applies when a court clerk's misconduct prevents proper service and notice, thereby relieving petitioner of the burden to prove a meritorious defense and prevention by fraud. 4. Whether Court Clerk Daniels' actions, performed under color of state law, give rise to federal civil rights claims under 42 U.S.C. Sections 1983, 1986, and 1988 for deprivation of constitutional rights. 5. Whether the statute of limitations is told by fraudulent concealment and the discovery rule when court clerk misconduct is inherently undiscoverable and actively concealed from the affected litigant. 6. Whether Judge Bruce Bain's improper recusal without investigating or reporting known fraud compounds the constitutional violations and requires reassignment to ensure impartial proceedings. 7. Whether this court should impose sanctions under Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 215 and other applicable authorities against all parties who participated in or benefited from the systematic fraud and misconduct. 11. 4. Argument. A. This court has jurisdiction and authority to grant relief. This court has full jurisdiction over this bill of review proceeding under Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 329B, F, and the inherent authority of Texas District Courts to remedy fraud upon the court. The bill of review is an independent equity proceeding designed specifically to address situations where a final judgment was procured through fraud, accident, or wrongful act that prevented a party from presenting their case. The allegations in this case present precisely the type of extraordinary circumstances that justify the extreme jealousy with which Texas courts guard the finality of judgments. When an officer of the court systematically corrupts the judicial process through record tampering, privacy violations, and denial of notice, the integrity of the entire system is at stake. This court not only has the authority but the constitutional duty to remedy such fundamental violations of due process. Moreover, the federal civil rights claims arising under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 provide this court with supplemental jurisdiction to address the constitutional violations that permeate this case. The systematic nature of the misconduct and its impact on the fundamental right to due process elevate this beyond a mere procedural dispute to a constitutional crisis requiring immediate judicial intervention. B. Petitioner satisfies all elements for bill of review relief. 1. Constitutional due process exception applies. Texas law recognizes a critical exception to the traditional 3-part bill of review test when a petitioner can prove they were denied fundamental due process. 12. Through lack of proper service or notice. As established in the legal authorities, when a petitioner proves they were never properly served with process or received no notice of a dispositive trial setting due to official misconduct, they are relieved of the burden of proving the first 2 elements, a meritorious defense and prevention by fraud or mistake. Here, the evidence conclusively establishes that Court Clerk Daniels' address manipulation prevented plaintiff from receiving any notice of the February 1, 2021 summary judgment hearing. By changing plaintiff's address of record to defendant's law firm address, 1401 McKinney, Houston, Texas, 77010, Clerk Daniels ensured that all court correspondence would go directly to opposing counsel rather than to plaintiff. This was not a mere clerical error but a deliberate act designed to deny plaintiff notice of proceedings in her own case. The constitutional principle underlying this exception is fundamental. Proper notice is not a mere technicality but a cornerstone of due process. As the Supreme Court held in Mullane v. Central Hanover Bank and Trust Company, 339 U.S. 306, 314, 1950, notice must be reasonably calculated, under all the circumstances, to apprise interested parties of the pendency of the action and afford them an opportunity to present their objections. When a court clerk deliberately manipulates the address system to prevent such notice, the resulting judgment is constitutionally void. Under this exception, petitioner need only prove the third element, that the judgment was rendered unmixed with their own fault or negligence. Texas law holds that this element is conclusively established by proof of non-service or lack of notice due to official misconduct. A party who has been deliberately denied notice through court clerk manipulation has no legal duty to monitor the case docket or appear at hearings of which they are unaware. The evidence here overwhelmingly establishes that plaintiff bore no fault or negligence in presenting adequate evidence at the summary judgment hearing. 13. Where key evidence was missing. She was represented by counsel until February 21, 2020, and had every right to rely on the integrity of the court's address and filing system. When that system was deliberately corrupted by the court clerk, plaintiff became an innocent victim of official misconduct rather than a negligent litigant, or should I say vexatious litigant is what Farwell is called by Jackson Walker LLPC. Letter filed in the Harris County District Court of Law number 11 on or about the 8th day of 2025 at approximately 12:05 p.m. 2. Traditional three-part test is also satisfied. Even if this court were to apply the traditional three-part bill of review test,
On the 8th day, let's get this right. Hold on right quick, y'all. On the 8th day of April, let's get this right. Let's get this right. Looks like we set up.
petitioner satisfies all elements. Element 1, meritorious defense. Plaintiff had multiple meritorious defenses to defendant's summary judgment motion, including A. Genuine issues of material fact regarding mold exposure and causation, B. Expert medical testimony supporting her claims, C. Documentary evidence of mold conditions in the apartment, and D. Evidence of defendant's knowledge of the mold problem and failure to remediate. The critical exhibits that were removed from the court record by Clerk Daniels contained medical records, expert reports, and photographic evidence that would have created genuine issues of material fact precluding summary judgment. As noted in Praisel v. Johnson, 967 S.W.2d 391, 394, Texas 1998, a plaintiff must show that their defense is not barred as a matter of law and would likely lead to a different outcome upon retrial. The evidence here clearly meets this standard. Element 2, prevention by fraud or wrongful act. The systematic misconduct by Court Clerk Daniels constitutes both fraud and wrongful act that prevented plaintiff from presenting her meritorious defense. The record tampering, address manipulation, and coordination with defense counsel represent extrinsic. 14. Fraud that was collateral to the issues in the case and prevented a fair adjudication on the merits. This fraud was not intrinsic to the case, such as perjured testimony that could have been exposed during trial, but extrinsic fraud that corrupted the very machinery of justice. By removing exhibits, manipulating addresses, and coordinating with opposing counsel, Clerk Daniels prevented plaintiff from even knowing about, much less participating in, the summary judgment proceeding. Element 3, no fault or negligence. As discussed above, plaintiff bore no fault or negligence in failing to defend against the summary judgment motion. She was entitled to rely on the integrity of the court systems and had no reason to suspect that the court clerk was actively sabotaging her case through record tampering and address manipulation. See Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels committed fraud upon the court. 1. Record tampering constitutes extrinsic fraud. The most serious aspect of Clerk Daniels' misconduct involves the systematic tampering with court records through the removal of critical exhibits from case number 2017 to 35,361. This conduct constitutes classic extrinsic fraud upon the court as defined in Caldwell v. Barnes, 154 S.W.3d 96, Texas 2004. Extrinsic fraud is fraud that is collateral to the issues in the case and prevents a party from fully and fairly presenting their claims or defenses. It is distinguished from intrinsic fraud, which pertains to matters that were or could have been litigated within the original trial. The removal of exhibits from the court record is the epitome of extrinsic fraud because it prevents the court from considering relevant evidence and denies the opposing party the opportunity to present their case. 15. Court clerks have a fundamental duty under Texas Government Code Section 51.205(b) to faithfully maintain court records and perform their duties as provided by law and the Texas Rules of Civil Procedure and in good faith. The deliberate removal of filed exhibits violates this statutory duty and constitutes a breach of the good faith standard that exposes the clerk to liability for resulting damages. The record tampering here was not a mere administrative error, but a deliberate act designed to skew the evidentiary record in favor of defendants. Document control records demonstrate that exhibits that were properly filed subsequently disappeared from the court record. This manipulation prevented the court from considering critical evidence supporting plaintiff's case and ensured that defendant's summary judgment motion would succeed. Such conduct strikes at the very heart of the judicial system's integrity. Courts rely on the faithful maintenance of records by court clerks to ensure that all relevant evidence is available for consideration. When a clerk deliberately corrupts this system, they commit fraud not just against the parties but against the court itself. 2. SSN privacy breaches violate TRCP 21C and federal law. Court Clerk Daniels' negligent exposure of plaintiff's Social Security number on the public court docket in March 2020 constitutes a serious violation of both state and federal law. Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 21C specifically requires the redaction of sensitive personal information, including Social Security numbers, from court filings. The rule places an affirmative duty on both filing parties and the clerk's office to protect such information. The violation also implicates federal privacy laws, including the Privacy Act, 5 U.S.C. Section 552A, which protects individuals from unauthorized disclosure of personal information by government agencies. While court clerks may not be directly subject to all provisions of the Privacy Act, the principles underlying the statute. 16. protection of personal privacy and prevention of identity theft, are clearly applicable to court operations. The SSN breach was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern of misconduct designed to compromise plaintiffs' privacy and security. In the context of the other fraudulent acts, this breach appears calculated to cause maximum harm to plaintiff while benefiting defendants who could potentially use the exposed information for improper purposes. The timing of the breach, March 2020, shortly after plaintiff's attorney withdrew, suggests coordination with other aspects of the fraudulent scheme. By exposing plaintiff's SSN at a time when Farwell was most vulnerable, without legal representation, Clerk Daniels maximized the potential harm while minimizing the likelihood of immediate detection and correction. 3. Processing delays demonstrate systematic misconduct. The deliberate processing delays in both the original case and the current bill of review demonstrate a pattern of systematic misconduct designed to deny plaintiff timely access to justice. The most egregious example is the 3-month delay in processing the current bill of review, which was filed on August 9, 2024, but not processed until November 4, 2024. This delay appears calculated to push the case closer to the 4-year statute of limitations deadline of July 8, 2025, thereby increasing the likelihood that defendants could successfully argue that the bill of review is time-barred. Such manipulation of processing times to affect substantive legal rights constitutes a fundamental breach of the clerk's duty to administer the court's business in a timely and impartial manner. 17. The processing delays also violate basic principles of due process by denying plaintiff timely access to the courts. When a court clerk deliberately delays the processing of filings to benefit one party over another, they violate the fundamental principle that all litigants are entitled to equal treatment under the law. These delays must be viewed in the context of the overall pattern of misconduct. They are not isolated administrative failures but part of a coordinated scheme to deny plaintiffs stay in court and ensure that defendants benefit from the fraudulently obtained summary judgment. D. Systematic due process violations require extraordinary relief. 1. 14th Amendment violations under color of state law. The systematic misconduct by Court Clerk Daniels constitutes a clear violation of plaintiffs' rights under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 14th Amendment prohibits any state from depriving a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and this guarantee encompasses both substantive and procedural due process protections. In the civil litigation context, procedural due process requires that a person be given adequate notice of a legal action against them and a meaningful opportunity to be heard before an impartial tribunal. As the Supreme Court established in Mullane v. Central Hanover Bank and Trust Company, 339 U.S. 306, 314, 1950, notice must be reasonably calculated, under all the circumstances, to apprise interested parties of the pendency of the action and afford them an opportunity to present their objections. Court Clerk Daniels' actions, record tampering, address manipulation, and processing delays, directly violated these fundamental requirements. By changing 18. Plaintiff's address to defendant's law firm, Clerk Daniels ensured that plaintiff would receive no notice of the summary judgment hearing. By removing critical exhibits from the court record, she prevented plaintiff from having a meaningful opportunity to be heard even if he had appeared. Critically, Clerk Daniels was acting under color of state law when she committed these violations. As a court clerk employed by Harris County, she was a state actor performing official duties. Her misconduct therefore constitutes state action subject to constitutional scrutiny under the 14th Amendment. The Texas Constitution's due course of the law provision in Article 1, Section 19 provides protections that are coextensive with the Federal Due Process Clause. Texas courts consistently interpret this provision as providing the same protections as the 14th Amendment, meaning that Clerk Daniels' actions violated both state and federal constitutional rights. 2. Address manipulation denied fundamental notice rights. The deliberate manipulation of plaintiff's address of record represents one of the most egregious due process violations in this case. By changing plaintiff's address from her actual residence to defendant's law firm address at 1401 McKinney, Houston, Texas, 77010, Clerk Daniels ensured that all court correspondence would be sent directly to opposing counsel rather than to plaintiff. This manipulation was not a clerical error, but a calculated act designed to deny plaintiff notice of proceedings in her own case. The evidence shows that this change was made in coordination with defense counsel, creating an improper ex parte relationship that violated fundamental principles of judicial neutrality. The constitutional significance of this manipulation cannot be overstated. Notice is not a mere procedural formality but a fundamental requirement of due process. 19. Without proper notice, a party cannot possibly defend their interests or participate meaningfully in the judicial process. The Supreme Court has consistently held that due process requires notice that is reasonably calculated to reach the interested party. Here, the notice was not merely inadequate, it was deliberately misdirected to ensure that plaintiff would never receive it. This represents a complete denial of the notice requirement, not merely a deficient attempt to provide notice. Such conduct violates the most basic principles of fairness and due process. 3. 8 years without impartial hearing violates due process. The cumulative effect of Clerk Daniels' misconduct has been to deny plaintiff an impartial hearing for over 8 years. From the initial filing in May 2017 through the present, plaintiff has been systematically prevented from having such case heard on the merits by an impartial tribunal. The due process analysis in Matthews v. Eldridge, 424 U.S. 319, 1976, requires courts to consider 1. The private interest affected, 2. The risk of erroneous deprivation through existing procedures, and 3. The government's interest in maintaining those procedures. Here, all three factors weigh heavily in favor of finding a due process violation. First, the private interest is substantial. Plaintiff's right to seek compensation for serious personal injuries caused by mold exposure. Second, the risk of erroneous deprivation is extremely high when court clerks are actively manipulating records and preventing notice. Third, the government has no legitimate interest in maintaining procedures that allow court clerks to engage in fraud and misconduct. The 8-year denial of an impartial hearing represents a systematic breakdown of the judicial process that demands extraordinary relief. This is not a case of mere 20. Procedural irregularities but a fundamental corruption of the machinery of justice that violates the most basic principles of due process. Federal civil rights claims provide additional grounds for relief. 1. 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 liability for constitutional violations. Court Clerk Daniels' systematic misconduct gives rise to a clear federal civil rights claim under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. This statute provides a cause of action against any person who, acting under color of state law, deprives another person of their rights, privileges, or immunities secured by the Constitution. The elements of a Section 1983 claim are, 1. The defendant acted under color of state law, and 2. The defendant's conduct deprived the plaintiff of a federally protected right. Both elements are clearly satisfied here. Color of state law, as established in Monroe v. Pape, 365 U.S. 167, 1961, the under color of state law requirement is satisfied when a defendant acts in their official capacity or exercises power possessed by virtue of state law. Court Clerk Daniels was unquestionably acting under color of state law when she performed her official duties as a Harris County Court clerk. Her misconduct occurred while she was exercising the authority vested in her by state law to maintain court records and administer court proceedings. Deprivation of federal rights. Clerk Daniels' actions deprived plaintiff of her clearly established right to procedural due process under the 14th Amendment. The right to adequate notice and a meaningful opportunity to be heard is fundamental and well established. By manipulating addresses, tampering with records, and coordinating with opposing counsel, Clerk Daniels denied plaintiff these basic constitutional protections. 21. The misconduct here goes beyond mere negligence to constitute deliberate indifference to plaintiff's constitutional rights. The systematic nature of the violations, spanning multiple years and involving multiple forms of misconduct, demonstrates a pattern of conduct that shocks the conscience and violates clearly established law. Qualified immunity does not apply. While some government officials may claim qualified immunity from Section 1983 liability, this defense is not available when the official's conduct violates clearly established constitutional rights that a reasonable person would have known. The right to due process in civil proceedings is so fundamental and well established that no reasonable court clerk could believe that record tampering and address manipulation were permissible. Moreover, qualified immunity protects only discretionary functions, not ministerial duties. Court clerks' duties to maintain accurate records and process filings in a timely manner are ministerial functions that do not involve the type of discretionary decision-making that qualified immunity is designed to protect. 2. 42 U.S.C. Section 1986 Liability for neglect to prevent violations. Section 1986 provides liability for any person who, having knowledge of the commission of civil rights violations and having the power to prevent them, neglects or refuses to do so. This statute is particularly relevant to the conduct of other court personnel and judicial officers who may have known of Clerk Daniels' misconduct but failed to take action to prevent it. The evidence suggests that multiple individuals within the court system may have been aware of the systematic misconduct but failed to take appropriate action. Court Coordinator Barbara Hopkins' unprofessional communications and failure to provide timely notice suggest either complicity or willful blindness to the ongoing violations. 22. Judge Bruce Bain's improper recusal without investigating the serious allegations of fraud may also constitute a violation of Section 1986. When presented with credible allegations of systematic misconduct by court personnel, a judge has a duty to investigate and take appropriate action. By simply recusing himself without addressing the underlying fraud, Judge Bain may have perpetuated the constitutional violations. 3. 42 U.S.C. Section 1988 Attorney's Fees and Costs. Section 1988 provides for the award of attorney's fees and costs to prevailing parties in civil rights actions. Given the systematic nature of the constitutional violations and the clear liability under Sections 1983 and 1986, plaintiff is entitled to recover reasonable attorney's fees and costs incurred in pursuing this action. The fee-shifting provision of Section 1988 serves the important purpose of encouraging private enforcement of civil rights laws and ensuring that victims of constitutional violations can obtain competent legal representation. The egregious nature of the misconduct in this case makes it particularly appropriate for a fee award. F. Statute of limitations does not bar this action. 1. Fraudulent concealment tolls limitations period. The 4-year statute of limitations for a bill of review based on fraud is told by the doctrine of fraudulent concealment. This equitable doctrine applies when a defendant has actual knowledge of a wrong and a duty to disclose it but conceals the wrong from the plaintiff. Court Clerk Daniels had actual knowledge of her misconduct. She was the one who removed exhibits, manipulated addresses, and coordinated with defense. 23. Counsel. As a court clerk, she had a duty to maintain the integrity of court records and ensure fair proceedings for all litigants. By actively concealing her misconduct and continuing to process the case as if nothing improper had occurred, she prevented plaintiff from discovering the fraud. The concealment was active, not passive. Clerk Daniels did not merely fail to disclose her misconduct. She took affirmative steps to hide it by maintaining the false address in the court record and processing the case in a manner designed to prevent discovery of the fraud. Under the fraudulent concealment doctrine, the statute of limitations does not begin to run until the fraud is discovered or, through reasonable diligence, should have been discovered. Here, the fraud was inherently undiscoverable because it involved manipulation of court records that plaintiff had no reason to suspect and no practical ability to detect. 2. Discovery rule applies to inherently undiscoverable misconduct. The discovery rule provides that a cause of action does not accrue until the plaintiff knew or should have known of the facts giving rise to the claim. This rule is particularly applicable when the injury is inherently undiscoverable, as is the case with court clerk misconduct involving record tampering and address manipulation. Plaintiff had no reason to suspect that court records were being tampered with or that her address had been deliberately changed to prevent her from receiving notice. Court clerks are presumed to act with integrity and in accordance with their statutory duties. A reasonable litigant would not suspect that a court clerk was actively sabotaging their case through record manipulation. The discovery rule is especially important in cases involving official misconduct because such conduct is typically concealed and involves a breach of the public. 24. Trust. Courts have consistently applied the discovery rule to toll limitations periods in cases involving government misconduct that is inherently difficult to detect. Here, the fraud was alleged throughout the appeals process and plaintiff didn't become knowledgeably to execute this bill of review until August of 2024, days before filing a writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court. Even then, the full scope of the misconduct only became apparent through careful analysis of court records and communications. This timeline demonstrates that the fraud was indeed inherently undiscoverable full scope and that the limitations period should be told until the date of discovery. See Appendix A. 3. Processing delays demonstrate continuing violation. The 3-month delay in processing the current bill of review, filed August 9, 2024, but not processed until November 4, 2024, demonstrates that the misconduct is continuing rather than completed. This continuing violation doctrine prevents defendants from benefiting from their own wrongdoing by running out the statute of limitations through deliberate delays. The processing delay appears calculated to push the case closer to the July 8, 2025, deadline, for years from the final summary judgment, thereby increasing the likelihood that defendants could successfully argue that relief is time-barred. Such manipulation of processing times to affect substantive legal rights constitutes a continuing violation that tolls the limitations period. Courts have consistently held that when a defendant's ongoing conduct prevents a plaintiff from pursuing their claims, the statute of limitations is tolled until the conduct ceases. Here, the clerk's office continues to engage in processing delays that impede plaintiffs' access to justice, demonstrating that the violation is ongoing rather than completed. 25. G. Judge Bruce Bain's improper recusal compounds constitutional violations. 1. Failure to report known fraud violates judicial duties. When the bill of review came before Judge Bruce Bain, he was presented with detailed allegations of systematic fraud and misconduct by court personnel. Rather than investigating these serious allegations or taking appropriate action to address them, Judge Bain simply recused himself from the case. This recusal violated Judge Bain's duties under the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct and federal law. When a judge becomes aware of credible allegations of fraud or misconduct by court personnel, they have a duty to investigate and take appropriate remedial action. This duty exists not only to protect the integrity of the judicial system but also to ensure that constitutional violations are addressed rather than perpetuated. By recusing himself without addressing the underlying fraud, Judge Bain effectively allowed the constitutional violations to continue. His failure to take action enabled the ongoing denial of due process and prevented the immediate relief that the serious nature of the allegations demanded. 2. Recusal without investigation perpetuates injustice. Judge Bain's recusal without investigation perpetuates the 8-year denial of justice that has characterized this case. When faced with allegations of systematic misconduct that have prevented a litigant from receiving a fair hearing for nearly a decade, a judge cannot simply walk away from the problem. 26. The proper response to such allegations would have been to 1. Conduct an immediate investigation into the misconduct. 2. Take appropriate remedial action to address any confirmed violations. 3. Refer the matter to appropriate authorities for further investigation and potential prosecution. And 4. Ensure that the affected litigant receives the fair hearing they have been denied. Instead, Judge Bain's recusal without action has resulted in further delay and continued denial of justice. This approach violates the fundamental principle that the judiciary has a responsibility to police its own operations and ensure that constitutional rights are protected. The recusal also raises questions about whether Judge Bain was aware of the misconduct before the bill of review was filed. If he had knowledge of Clerk Daniels' actions and failed to take appropriate action, he may bear some responsibility for the continuing constitutional violations. D. Relief requested. Wherefore, Petitioner Spencer Farwell respectfully requests that this honorable court grant the following relief. A. Immediate relief. 1. Set aside final summary judgment. Enter an order setting aside the July 8, 2021 final summary judgment in case number 2017 to 35,361 as void due to extrinsic fraud, constitutional due process violations, and systematic court clerk misconduct. 2. Order to show cause. Issue an order to show cause requiring Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels, Court Coordinator Barbara Hopkins, and any other implicated court personnel to appear before this court and show cause why they should not be held in contempt for their systematic misconduct and constitutional violations. 27. 3. Immediate investigation. Order an immediate and comprehensive investigation into the conduct of all court personnel involved in case number 2017 to 35,361, including but not limited to document control procedures, address management systems, and communications with parties and counsel. 4. Case reassignment. Reassign this matter and any related proceedings to an impartial judge who has had no prior involvement with the case and can ensure fair and unbiased proceedings going forward. B. Discovery and sanctions. 5. Full discovery. Order full discovery including production of all documents, communications, and records related to case number 2017 to 35,361, including but not limited to all email communications between court personnel and counsel, document control logs and filing records, address change records and authorization documents, processing logs and case management records, any other documents relevant to the alleged misconduct. 6. Sanctions under TRCP 215. Impose sanctions under Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 215 against all parties who participated in or benefited from the systematic fraud and misconduct, including but not limited to monetary sanctions sufficient to deter future misconduct, payment of all costs and attorney's fees incurred by plaintiff, such other sanctions as the court deems appropriate. 7. Contempt proceedings. Initiate contempt proceedings against Court Clerk Bristol and Daniels and any other court personnel found to have willfully violated. 28. Court orders or engaged in conduct that undermines the integrity of the judicial process. See Federal Civil Rights Relief. 8. Federal Civil Rights Damages. Award damages under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 for the systematic deprivation of plaintiffs' constitutional rights, including but not limited to compensatory damages for the denial of due process, punitive damages to deter future misconduct, consequential damages resulting from the fraudulent judgment. 9. Section 1986 Liability. Hold liable under 42 U.S.C. Section 1986 any persons who had knowledge of the civil rights violations and the power to prevent them but neglected or refused to do so. 10. Attorney's fees and costs. Award reasonable attorney's fees and costs under 42 U.S.C. Section 1988 for the successful prosecution of the civil rights action. D. Systemic reform and prevention. 11. Injunctive relief. Enter appropriate injunctive relief to prevent future misconduct, including but not limited to implementation of enhanced oversight procedures for court clerk operations, mandatory training on constitutional due process requirements, establishment of independent monitoring systems for case processing, creation of whistleblower protections for court personnel who report misconduct. 29. 12. Referral for criminal investigation. Refer the matter to appropriate law enforcement authorities for investigation of potential criminal violations, including but not limited to tampering with governmental records, official oppression, and conspiracy. E. Additional relief. 13. Restoration of original case. Order the restoration of case number 2017 to 35,361 to the active docket with all original exhibits and filings properly restored to the court record. 14. Expedited proceedings. Given the approaching statute of limitations deadline of July 8, 2025, order expedited proceedings to ensure that plaintiffs' rights are protected and that justice is not further delayed. 15. General relief. Grant such other and further relief as this court deems just and proper under the circumstances. 6. Conclusion. This case presents one of the most egregious examples of systematic court clerk misconduct and constitutional violations ever to come before a Texas court. For over 8 years, Celine McDade has been denied her fundamental right to due process through a coordinated scheme of fraud, record tampering, and deliberate obstruction orchestrated by court clerk Bristol and Daniels. The evidence is overwhelming and undisputed. Clerk Daniels removed critical exhibits from the court record, exposed plaintiff Farwell's social security number in violation of state and federal law, manipulated plaintiff's address to prevent notice of proceedings, and coordinated with defense counsel to ensure that plaintiff remained unaware of critical hearings. These actions constitute extrinsic fraud. 30. Upon the court, systematic due process violations, and clear violations of federal civil rights laws. The constitutional principles at stake are fundamental to our system of justice. When court clerks can manipulate records and deny notice with impunity, the entire judicial system loses its legitimacy. When litigants can be systematically excluded from their own cases through official misconduct, the promise of equal justice under law becomes meaningless. This court has both the authority and the constitutional duty to remedy these violations. The Bill of Review provides the appropriate vehicle for setting aside a judgment that was procured through such systematic fraud. The federal civil rights laws provide additional grounds for holding the perpetrators accountable and ensuring that such misconduct never occurs again. The approaching statute of limitations deadline creates urgency, but it cannot be allowed to shield the perpetrators from accountability. The fraudulent concealment and discovery rule doctrines, combined with the continuing violation theory, clearly establish that this action is timely filed and that relief is appropriate. Most importantly, this case is about more than one plaintiff's right to justice. It is about the integrity of the entire judicial system. When court personnel can engage in systematic fraud without consequence, public confidence in the courts is undermined and the rule of law is threatened. This court has the opportunity to send a clear message that such conduct will not be tolerated and that the constitutional rights of all litigants will be protected. For all these reasons, petitioner respectfully urges this court to grant the relief requested and to take all necessary action to remedy the systematic constitutional violations that have characterized this case for far too long. 31. The evidence compels the conclusion that extraordinary relief is not only warranted but constitutionally required. Justice delayed is justice denied, and after 8 years of systematic misconduct, the time for justice is now. Respectfully submitted, ________________________
I saw God today. You heard it?